The Colonization of Australia presentation. Now, I want to start off and tell you how Australia is today. Now, Australia is a very big and rich country, as Australia has many natural resources and a major exporter of energy, natural resources, and food. With all this, it makes Australia a very wealthy and successful country. Now, a few other reasons why Australia is so wealthy and successful right now is that their economy has grown at a healthy pace for the past 2 decades. They have very low unemployment, low public debt, and inflation. As the graph you just saw, it shows how low Australia's debt really is compared to the rest of the world's. Now, there is a reason for Australia being so successful as it is today, and that all started back with the colonization of Australia. Before I go into the colonization of Australia and of how it got to the way it is today, I am first going to explain a little more about Australia. Now, Australia is also known for the very high life expectancy. It is about 82.4 years for the average person in Australia. As you see at the graph above, it ranks 5th overall out of all countries in the world. So Australia has such a high life expectancy due to their colonial history, as I'll explain later. Anyways, the country developed as a democracy, which means the people have rights, freedoms, access to government, and healthcare. Another thing that makes Australia wealthy is their GDP per capita. Australia ranks around 11th on the measure in terms of GDP per capita, with $55,707 per capita GDP in 2017. This little side note, Australia also has some very cute and tasty animals, like this guy up above. To add on, Australia also has a very low infant mortality rate compared to the rest of the world. Now, let's go back in time to the start of the colonization of Australia. And through that, we're going to explain how Australia got to the way it is today and why they're one of the best countries in the world due to colonizations and good institutions. So Australia was first founded in 1606 by the Dutch. The Dutch explorers explored the southwest side of Australia and did not claim this land as their own. They ended up naming it New Holland and left it with that. With the Dutch not claiming Australia or New Holland at this time, this left it open for the British to come and take this land for their own. Now, jumping to the year 1770, where British officially landed in Australia. A man named of Captain Cook landed in Australia on August 22nd, 1770, where they officially claimed New Holland as British territory. Now, just 8 years later, after the British claim Australia as their territory, the process of colonization begins. So, with the colonization of Australia beginning, it started off with the British sending convicts over to 13 colonies and imprisoning them there. With the War of Independence starting in 1776, the British had to move all their convicts and find a new place for them. Another problem the British had were their prisons in England were overrun and they needed a new place to place their prisoners. So they had prisoners from 13 colonies and England all taken in 11 ships to Australia. There were around just over 700 convicts taken to Australia. Now, once all the convicts were in Australia, this started the first penal colony of the New South Wales, and it mostly consisted of convicts, guards, and mostly soldiers. Now, with all the convicts in Australia, they were all had to perform compulsory work, which is forced labor. The convicts had no pay. The only thing they were given were food in return for the labor. They were not allowed to keep anything they produced for like farming, and the guards took what they had. Now, the convicts were not happy about this as they were working and not getting anything out of it. This was very similar to the Virginia Company that started in Jamestown, as that failed as well. So with this problem with the convicts not working, the soldiers and guards thought of another idea to use the Aboriginals as slaves. But this did not work either, as the Aboriginals were all spread out across Australia and they couldn't just take them and use them. It was very difficult. So that did not work out. Now, the soldiers and guards thought of an idea that would lead to institutions that were more inclusive than those in Britain. Now, the convicts were given sets of jobs, for example, like farming, building, and etc. They were paid for their jobs and eventually given land and homes to live. Now, with the convicts making their own money, they're very more easy to work with. Now, once the convicts had served their sentence, they had all their rights restored, and they had their own land to make their own money. There was lots of money in farming, such as wool farming, and that's how a lot of Australians started to get rich. Now, this was the start of the creation of an economy that was based on their exploration. Now in Australia, they found it in their interest to create an economic institutions that made them more inclusive than most countries at this time. As Australia was very successful at this time and progressing well, until the British government sent a man with the name of John Bigge to the colony. He was shocked to see how the convicts have had their own land, making money, having jobs. He did not like this. So what he wanted to do, he wanted to change all this and turn it back to the way it should be, as he thought, the convicts back in jail with no land, with none of their rights. Now, if you can imagine, the ex-convicts and their families were not happy at all with this decision. So what they needed was political institutions. So the people started demanding elections, which they could participate as equals and represent the institutions. Now, there was a government at this time in the colony, but did not have much rule, as the British had most of the control. But not until 1831, when the government of Australia gave rights to convicts, such as being able to sit on juries and being able to elect if they had enough property, as many did. Now, that was pretty much the start of more inclusive political institutions at this time. From here, this was the start of Australia. They became more successful as time went on, but not in the way you think. But they had many precious gold metals, like gold and silver. They had soil crops that could make Australia lots of money. But since there weren't too many people living there at the time, this created more jobs for the people in Australia. They didn't have to use slaves or forced laborers. This is what's made Australia so successful and why it is so successful today. Australia had now created an inclusive economic institutions and inclusive political institutions. Now, helping them out through history and not barely having any struggles. This is clearly seen now today, as I talked about earlier in the video, of how Australia's life expectancy is so high and why their GDP per capita is also one of the best in the world. This is due to the colonization of Australia.